Ambassador Keith Avorin stood on the observation deck of his flagship and watched the blue planet grow larger in the viewing screen. Earth, such a small world, such a young species. He had performed 200 planetary integrations in his long career, and he already knew this one would be the easiest of them all. The Valoran Empire had ruled 3/4 of the known galaxy for 12,000 years. Every species eventually joined. Some came willingly, eager for the gifts the Empire offered. Others resisted at first, but they always surrendered in the end. The Empire had perfected the art of absorption over millennia. They knew exactly what every species wanted, and they knew how to offer it in ways that seemed generous rather than threatening. Snort's humans had achieved faster than light travel. Only 60 years ago, they were practically infants by galactic standards. Kevorin had read the intelligence reports with mild amusement. Humans had fought two massive wars among themselves in the previous century. They had nearly destroyed their own planet with pollution. They argued constantly about politics, religion, and economics. By every measure, they were a chaotic and primitive species desperately in need of guidance. The integration fleet entered orbit around Earth with tremendous fanfare. 300 warships arranged themselves in a perfect geometric pattern that could be seen from the planet's surface. It was a display designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The message was clear. The Empire was powerful beyond imagination, but it came in peace. Keen transmitted the standard greeting and requested a meeting with Earth's leaders. The response came within hours. The United Earth Council would be honored to receive the ambassador at their headquarters in Geneva. Everything was proceeding exactly as expected. The ambassador's shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere and landed on a platform outside a glass and steel building. Keth Varen emerged to find a delegation of humans waiting for him. They were smaller than he expected, soft-looking creatures with no natural armor or weapons. How had such fragile beings survived on a planet with predators, earthquakes, and violent weather? It was almost amusing. A woman stepped forward from the group. She was dark-skinned with gray hair and calm eyes that studied him without fear. Ambassador Keth Varen, I am Secretary General Amara Akinquo. Welcome to Earth. We are honored by your visit. Her voice was warm and genuine. Keith Avorin had met thousands of planetary leaders, and he could usually detect fear or greed within seconds. This woman showed neither. She seemed merely curious, as if he were an interesting guest rather than the representative of an empire that could destroy her world with a single command. The honor is mine, Secretary General, Keth Varen replied with practiced grace. The Valoran Empire has watched humanity's progress with great interest. We believe the time has come to welcome you into the galactic community. She smiled and gestured toward the building. Please come inside. We are eager to hear what you have to say. The meeting chamber was large but simply decorated. Human leaders from every nation sat around a curved table, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and caution. Keith Varen had seen this before. New species were always nervous during first contact. That nervousness usually made them easy to manipulate. He activated his presentation and began the standard integration speech. The empire was vast and ancient. It provided peace, prosperity and protection to all its member worlds. Species that joined gained access to technology that would advance their civilization by centuries. They gained trading partners across thousands of star systems. They gained security from pirates, natural disasters, and hostile forces. The benefits were beyond calculation. The humans listened politely for 3 hours. They asked thoughtful questions about trade agreements, military obligations, and cultural preservation. Keith Warren answered each one with a smooth confidence of long experience. Yes. Member species maintained their own governments. Yes, they kept their own cultures and traditions. Yes, the empire asked for very little in return, just cooperation, just loyalty, just a small tribute to support the imperial infrastructure that made everything possible. When he finished, Secretary General Okonkwo thanked him sincerely for the detailed explanation. Then she said something that Catherine had never heard before in 200 integrations. We appreciate this generous offer, Ambassador. Truly we do, but after careful consideration, the United Earth Council has decided to decline. Keith Varen's translator implant must have malfunctioned. I apologize, Secretary General. Could you repeat that? We decline, she said, still smiling warmly. We are grateful for the Empire's interest, but humanity prefers to remain independent at this time. The ambassador stared at her for a long moment. This had never happened. Species bargained. Species made counter-offers. Species asked for better terms, but they did not simply say no. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding, he said carefully. Let me explain the economic benefits in greater detail. Over the next several weeks, Keith Vaughan presented offer after offer with increasing generosity. He offered unlimited access to galactic trade networks that would make every human wealthy beyond their dreams. He offered manufacturing technology that would eliminate poverty on Earth within a decade. He offered medical advances that could double human lifespans and cure diseases that had plagued them for centuries. The humans examined everything carefully. They asked intelligent questions. They expressed genuine appreciation for the Empire's generosity, and then they politely declined each and every offer. Keith Vaughan switched tactics. Intelligence reports indicated that humans had a long history of warfare. Surely they understood the value of security. He offered the full protection of the Imperial Navy, 10,000 warships that would defend Earth from any threat in the galaxy. No pirate would dare approach human space. No hostile species would ever threaten their colonies. Humanity would be safe forever under the Empire's shield. Secretary General Okonkwo listened to the entire presentation. She asked about command structures, response times in the Empire's history of military interventions. Then she thanked him again and declined. Your military is impressive, Ambassador, she said, but we prefer to provide for our own defense. With respect, Secretary General, your fleet is tiny compared to potential threats. You have perhaps 300 combat-capable vessels. The Empire has millions. We understand our limitations, she replied calmly, but we believe that depending on others for protection creates dependency that is difficult to escape. We would rather build our own strength slowly than accept strength that belongs to someone else. Kebran began to feel something he had not experienced in Decades frustration, he returned to his ship and filed confused reports with Imperial Command. The humans were not responding to standard integration protocols. They were not being hostile or unreasonable. They were simply refusing to cooperate. Imperial Command responded with new instructions, offer them technology, not just medical advances or manufacturing equipment, but the truly advanced systems that primitive species always craved. Artificial intelligence that could solve any problem, clean energy that would last forever, computing power that would advance human science by 500 years in a single generation. Kevon presented this offer with renewed confidence. No species had ever refused technological uplift. The desire to advance, to grow, to become more than they were was universal among intelligent beings. Humans would not be different, but they were different. The human scientists who examined the offered technology were clearly impressed. They asked endless questions about how the systems worked, what principles they operated on, what limitations they had. They spent weeks studying everything with obvious fascination, and then they gave the same answer as before. We are grateful for this opportunity, Secretary General Akono said, but we believe that technology gained too quickly is technology that is not truly understood. We prefer to develop our own capabilities at our own pace. Keith Varon requested a private meeting with the Secretary General. He needed to understand what was happening. No species behaved this way. There had to be something she wanted, some hidden desire he had failed to identify. Every being had a price. Every civilization had a weakness. He just needed to find humanity's. They met in her office, a modest room with windows overlooking a garden. She offered him tea, which he declined, and then sat across from him with the same patient calm she had shown from the beginning. Secretary General, I must ask you directly, why does humanity refuse every offer we make? The Empire offers genuine benefits with very few obligations. Other species consider membership a privilege. Why are humans different? She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the garden. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, rather than confrontational. Ambassador, we have studied your empire carefully. We have analyzed your history, your economic systems, your military structures, and your relationships with member species. We have learned a great deal. And what have you learned? That gifts from empires are never free. She turned to face him directly. Every offer you make creates a dependency. Economic integration makes species unable to survive without imperial trade. Military protection makes them unable to defend themselves. Technological uplift makes them unable to innovate. Over time, member species become components of the empire rather than independent civilizations. They lose the ability to choose their own path. Keith Vorn had no response. She was describing the integration process with uncomfortable accuracy. The empire did not conquer species through force. It absorbed them through generosity, slowly making them unable to exist outside imperial structures. It was a system that had worked perfectly for 12,000 years, and this young species had seen through it immediately. We have read enough history to know where this road leads. The Secretary General continued, not just your history, Ambassador, our own. Humanity has been conquered before by empires that offered peace and prosperity in exchange for submission. We learned those lessons. Through great suffering, we will not forget them. Clear's throat. She stood and extended her hand in what Catherine had learned was a human gesture of respect. We hope for friendship with the Empire ambassador. We hope for fair trade and peaceful coexistence, but we will not become part of your system. We will find our own way among the stars. Kevin returned to his ship that evening and sat alone in his quarters for a long time. In 2 centuries of service, he had never failed to complete an integration. He had never even imagined that failure was possible. Species wanted what the Empire offered. They always had, they always would, but humanity did not. He began composing his report to Imperial Command, and for the first time in his career, he did not know what to recommend. Force would work, of course. The Empire could conquer Earth easily, but that was not how integrations were supposed to happen. Conquest created resentment that lasted for generations. The system required willing participation, and humanity was not willing. As he wrote, Catherine felt the first stirrings of something that might have been doubt. The Empire had perfected integration over 12,000 years, but perhaps perfection had made them blind. Perhaps they had forgotten how to deal with species that valued something more than comfort and security. Perhaps they had forgotten what freedom meant. He finished his report and sent it through the communication network. Somewhere in the imperial capital, officials would read his words and struggle to understand them. Somewhere the first whispers of unease would begin spreading through the halls of power. Humanity had said no, and no one knew what to do about it. 6 months had passed since humanity's refusal, and the Imperial Council was growing concerned, not because Earth posed any military threat. A single sector fleet could reduce the planet to ash within hours. The concern was something far more dangerous than weapons or armies. The concern was gossip. High Executive Morvan stood before the council and delivered his report with visible discomfort. The situation has become politically complicated. Word of humanity's refusal has spread throughout the Empire. Subject species are discussing it openly. A junior race said no to integration and nothing happened. The implications are troubling. Emperor Valadro sat on his throne, listening with ancient eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. He was old, even by Valoran standards, having ruled for 300 years. In all that time, no species had successfully resisted integration. The system was designed to be irresistible. What do our analysts recommend? The Emperor asked. Pressure. Morvan replied, not military force but economic and political pressure. We make independence uncomfortable. We show humanity that cooperation with the Empire is the only path to prosperity. The Emperor nodded slowly. It was the obvious approach. Species that refuse generosity often responded to difficulty. The Empire had many ways to make life hard for those who chose isolation. Over the following months, things began going wrong for humanity. Trade routes near Sol system became unstable. Ships carrying human goods encountered unexpected delays and inspections. Galactic markets that had been open to Earth suddenly imposed tariffs and restrictions. Pirates began appearing in human space, attacking merchant vessels, and disappearing before patrols could respond. The Empire never officially acknowledged any connection to these problems. When human diplomats complained, imperial officials expressed sympathy and promised to investigate. Nothing changed. The message was clear enough for anyone to understand. Cooperation was optional, but isolation had consequences. Ambassador Kethorin watched from his station in orbit around Earth, expecting the humans to break at any moment. Economic pressure always worked. Eventually, species could not survive alone in a galaxy dominated by imperial trade networks. Sooner or later, practical concerns would overcome stubborn pride, but humanity did not break. Instead, they adapted. The human response to economic isolation was swift and surprising. Instead of begging for access to imperial markets, they accelerated their own development. Shipyards expanded in the asteroid belts around Sol. Mining operations spread to every rocky body in the system. Manufacturing facilities appeared on moons and orbital platforms, producing everything from basic goods to advanced technology. Human engineers worked with desperate intensity, reverse engineering every piece of alien technology they had ever acquired. Their FTL drives improved. Their weapons became more sophisticated. Their sensors grew more accurate. They were still centuries behind the Empire in most areas, but the gap was closing faster than anyone had predicted. More troubling was what the humans did next. Instead of retreating into isolation, they began reaching out to other species, not to the Empire's loyal members, but to the small, independent worlds that existed on the fringes of imperial space. Mining colonies, research outposts, refugee settlements, the forgotten corners of the galaxy that the Empire had never bothered to absorb. Human diplomats appeared on these worlds with offers that were strange and unprecedented. They did not ask for tribute or loyalty. They did not demand integration into human systems. They simply proposed trade, fair exchanges of goods and services between equals. No strings attached, no clear throat, hidden obligations. It was such a simple idea that most species did not know how to respond. Trade in the Empire was never between equals. Larger species set terms that smaller species accepted. The concept of genuine partnership was almost incomprehensible, but some species were curious enough to try. Small agreements were signed. Human ships began appearing in distant ports, carrying goods and asking for nothing but fair payment. Word spread through underground networks that had existed for millennia. The humans were different. The humans could be trusted. Imperial intelligence reported these developments with growing alarm. Humanity was building something that looked almost like an alternative to the Empire. Not a rival power exactly, more like a different way of doing things. Proof of concept that showed integration was not the only option. High Executive Morven decided it was time for more direct pressure. He traveled to Earth personally, requesting a meeting with Secretary General Okonkwo. His ship landed in Geneva with none of the ceremony that had accompanied the ambassador's arrival. This was not a diplomatic visit, it was a warning. They met in the same conference room where Kethvorin had made his offers. Morven did not bother with pleasantries. He was tall for Valoran, with hard eyes and a reputation for efficiency that bordered on ruthlessness. Secretary General, the Empire has been patient with humanity. We have respected your desire for independence, but your recent activities are causing problems. That cannot be ignored. What activities concern you? She asked calmly. Your diplomatic contacts with minor species, your trade agreements outside imperial oversight, your obvious attempts to build an alternative network that undermines our economic systems. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something that was almost threatening. The Empire does not tolerate disruption. I suggest you reconsider your position before patience runs out. Akono studied him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was still warm, but there was still beneath the warmth that had not been there 6 months ago. High Executive, humanity has not violated any treaties because we have not signed any treaties. We trade with willing partners. We build relationships with species that choose to work with us. Nothing we do is illegal by any standard. Legal is not the same as wise. Morven replied, there are many things the Empire can do that require no legal justification. Trade routes can become dangerous. Resources can become scarce. Accidents can happen to ships and stations. I trust you understand what I'm saying. I understand perfectly, she said. You are threatening us. You are telling us that if we do not submit to imperial authority, we will suffer consequences. Is that accurate? Morven had not expected her to state it so directly. Most species pretended not to understand implicit threats. It made everyone more comfortable. But this woman looked at him without flinching, demanding that he acknowledge what he was doing. The Empire prefers cooperation, he said carefully, but we are prepared to protect our interests. So are we. She stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. High Executive, humanity has survived ice ages, plagues, and wars that killed hundreds of millions. We have pulled ourselves back from the edge of extinction more times than you can imagine. Your threats do not frighten us. They only confirm that we were right to refuse your offers. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. We know we cannot defeat the Empire in open war. We are not foolish enough to believe otherwise, but we also know that empires are not as strong as they appear. They have weaknesses that smaller powers can exploit. They have subjects who remember what freedom felt like. They have cracks that grow wider under pressure. She turned back to face him. Go back to your emperor, High Executive. Tell him that humanity will not be intimidated. Tell him that every threat he makes will be answered with greater determination. And tell him that if he chooses war, the galaxy will be watching. Every species that has ever dreamed of independence will see what happens, and they will remember. Morven left Earth that day with a feeling he had not experienced in decades. Fear not of humanity's military power, which was still insignificant compared to the Empire. He feared something else entirely. He feared what humanity represented. For 12,000 years, the Empire had maintained control through simple system. Resistance was futile, so species did not resist. Integration was inevitable, so species did not struggle against it. The system worked because everyone believed it worked. Faith in imperial power kept the peace far more effectively than actual force. But humanity did not believe. They looked at the Empire and saw something that could be challenged. They looked at integration and saw something that could be refused. They looked at inevitability and saw opportunity instead of fate. If other species started believing the same thing, the entire system would collapse. The Empire could not actually control every world with military force. There were too many planets, too many species, too many potential rebellions. Control depended on obedience, and obedience depended on the belief that nothing else was possible. Humanity was proving that something else was possible. Morven returned to the imperial capital and delivered his report in person. Emp. Baladros listened without interruption, his ancient face showing nothing. When the high executive finished, the throne room was silent for a long time. What do you recommend? The emperor finally asked. Morven hesitated. The answer was obvious but terrible. We must make an example of them, your majesty. Destroy their fleet, occupy their planet, and show the galaxy that defiance has consequences. Every year we wait, they grow stronger and their ideas spread further. And what will the subject species think when they see us conquer a world that only wanted independence? They will think that resistance is futile, as they should. The emperor was quiet again. Morven could not read his expression. After 300 years on the throne, Baladros had learned to hide his thoughts from everyone. Prepare a battle fleet, the emperor said at last. But do not attack yet. Give humanity one final chance to accept integration. Make clear that refusal means war. He paused and something flickered in his ancient eyes. I want to see how they respond. I want to understand what we are truly dealing with. The order went out across the empire. 300 capital ships began gathering near Sol system, largest concentration of military force in a century. A message that could not be misunderstood. Humanity had 30 days to surrender or face destruction. And across the galaxy, in mining colonies and research stations and refugee camps, species that had been silent for millennia began to whisper. The humans were standing against the Empire. The humans were refusing to kneel. Perhaps, just perhaps, they were not alone in that desire. The cracks that Secretary General Okonkwo had mentioned were starting to spread, and the Empire, for the first time in 12,000 years, was not certain how to stop them. The Imperial battle fleet arrived in Sol system on the first day of the ultimatum. 300 capital ships arranged themselves in a formation that blocked the stars. Each vessel was larger than anything humanity had ever built, carrying weapons that could reduce continents to glass. It was the most overwhelming display of military power the galaxy had seen in generations. Fleet Admiral Torbex commanded from the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion. He was a veteran of countless engagements, having crushed rebellions and pirate fleets across half the galaxy. This assignment should have been beneath his rank. Primitive species with a few hundred small ships posed no real military challenge, but the Emperor had insisted on overwhelming force. There would be no doubt about the outcome. Ambassador Kevorin had been recalled to the fleet to deliver the final ultimatum. He stood beside the Admiral, watching Earth grow larger in the viewing screens. 6 months of failed negotiations had left him exhausted and confused. He still did not understand why humanity refused to accept what every other species embraced. Perhaps they would understand when they saw the fleet that had come to destroy them. The transmission went out across all Frequencies, every human with a communications device could hear the words that would decide their fate. People of Earth, this is Ambassador Kevorian of the Valorian Empire. You have been offered friendship and prosperity. You have been offered protection and advancement. You have refused every gift we have given. Now you are offered one final choice: accept integration into the Empire as a protected vassal state, or face the consequences of your defiance. You have 30 days to respond. If you refuse or if you fail to respond, the fleet you see before you will reduce your civilization to ashes. Consider carefully, there will be no further warnings. The transmission ended and silence fell across Sol system. The fleet waited. The clock began counting down. On Earth, the response was not panic or despair. Secretary General Okonkwo addressed the United Earth Council in an emergency session that lasted 3 days. The debate was fierce, but focus. Surrender was discussed and rejected unanimously. Humanity had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. They would not waste those preparations now. The truth was that humanity had never expected the Empire to simply accept their refusal. From the moment they first detected Imperial communications decades ago, human strategists had been planning for this confrontation. Every offer they rejected, every month they bought through diplomacy had been used to build defenses that the Empire could not imagine. Human shipyards had not been building the large warships that dominated Imperial doctrine. Instead, they had constructed thousands of small, fast vessels designed for a completely different kind of warfare. These ships were cheap to build and easy to crew. Individually, they were insignificant. Together, they formed something that had never been seen in galactic combat. But the ships were only part of the preparation. Across Sol system, hidden in asteroid fields and buried beneath moon surfaces, a network of sensors and weapons platforms had been quietly growing. Human engineers had studied every Imperial battle and recorded history, analyzing tactics, identifying patterns, and designing countermeasures for every scenario. They knew how Imperial fleets fought. They knew their formations, their standard responses, their predictable patterns of aggression. Most importantly, they knew that Imperial commanders had never faced an enemy that fought like humans. Earth's military history was a catalog of asymmetric warfare, smaller forces defeating larger ones through mobility, deception, and sheer stubborn endurance. Guerrilla campaigns that exhausted empires, naval battles decided by unexpected tactics rather than superior firepower. Humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other, and they had learned lessons that the Empire, with its overwhelming advantages, had never needed to consider. There was another element to humanity's preparation that would have disturbed the Empire even more if they had known about it. Over the past 3 years, human diplomats had been busy. Those small trade agreements with minor species had grown into something larger, a network of mutual support that stretched across the fringes of Imperial space. 12 species had secretly pledged to support humanity if war came. They could not offer military assistance. Their fleets were too small and too far away to make a difference in battle, but they could offer something almost as valuable: intelligence, communications, supply routes, 1,000 small advantages that would help humanity survive long enough to make the Empire reconsider. These allies had their own reasons for supporting Earth. They had watched humanity refuse integration and survive. They had seen that the Empire was not actually all-powerful, perhaps. Most importantly, they had heard Secretary General Okonkwo's message about freedom and self-determination for species that had lived in the Empire's shadow for millennia. Those words had power beyond measure. Day 29 of the ultimatum arrived. The Imperial fleet had grown bored with waiting. Admiral Torx expected the humans to surrender at any moment. Every species eventually surrendered when faced with destruction. It was simply how things worked. Then Secretary General Okonkwo broadcast a message that reached every corner of the galaxy, not just Sol's system but every world with communications equipment capable of receiving long-range transmissions. It was the most widely heard speech in galactic history. She did not threaten. She did not boast about human power. She simply spoke about what humanity valued and why they would not surrender it. We are a young species, she said. We have made terrible mistakes in our history. We have waged wars against each other. We have committed atrocities that still haunt our collective memory. We are not better than other species, and we do not claim to be, but we have learned something through our suffering. We have learned that freedom is not a gift that can be given by the powerful to the weak. Freedom must be claimed. It must be defended. It must sometimes be paid for in blood and sacrifice. The Empire offers us peace and prosperity, but peace without freedom is just comfortable slavery. Prosperity without independence is just a well-furnished cage. We reject these offers not because we do not want comfort and security, but because we know their true cost. We will not surrender. We will not kneel if the Empire chooses to destroy us. We will fight until our last ship burns and our last soldier falls. And even then, the idea we represent will survive, because there are beings throughout this galaxy who remember what freedom felt like. There are species who have dreamed of independence for millennia, but never believed it was possible. We say to them, now it is possible. Resistance is not futile. The Empire is powerful, but it is not invincible. One day, perhaps not soon, but inevitably, the old order will fall, and what rises in its place will be determined by those who have the courage to imagine something better. To the Valoran Empire, we say simply this: we do not seek your destruction. We do not hate your people. We only ask to be left alone to find our own path among the stars. If that request is denied, we will defend ourselves with everything we have. The choice is yours. The speech ended and chaos erupted across the galaxy. On 14 worlds, citizens took to the streets demanding answers. Why was the Empire threatening a species that only wanted independence? Why were such massive military forces being deployed against a primitive planet? The questions had no good answers. Admiral Torx received reports of unrest with growing irritation. This was supposed to be a simple demonstration of force. Humanity was supposed to surrender, not inspire rebellion. He gave orders for the fleet to power weapons and prepare for assault. The 30 days were almost over. It was time to end this farce. Then his censor officer looked up from her console with an expression of absolute shock. Admiral, we are detecting multiple contacts emerging from the asteroid field. How many contacts? 17,000, sir, and counting. Torvax felt his blood run cold. Imperial intelligence had estimated humanity's fleet at 300 vessels at most. 17,000 was impossible. Where had they come from? How had they been built in secret? The human ships were small, barely larger than fighters by Imperial standards. They emerged from hiding places throughout Sol system like insects, swarming from a disturbed nest. More kept appearing every minute. 18,000, 19,000, 20,000. They did not arrange themselves in traditional battle formations. Instead, they spread across space in shifting patterns that Imperial tactical computers struggled to analyze. They moved with coordination that suggested a single controlling intelligence, weaving and flowing like schools of fish responding to predators. Torvex realized with horrible clarity that the humans had been planning this for years. Every diplomatic delay, every rejected offer, every month of negotiations had been used to build this fleet in secret. They had studied Imperial tactics and designed a force specifically intended to counter them. Imperial doctrine assumed overwhelming firepower would win any engagement. Human doctrine assumed nothing of the kind. The Battle of Sol was about to begin, and for the first time in 12,000 years the outcome was not certain. Admiral Clear's throat, Torvox gave the order to attack at dawn by Earth's reckoning. 300 Imperial capital ships advanced in perfect formation, their weapons charged and their crews confident despite the unexpected numbers they faced. The Empire had fought outnumbered before. Superior technology and training always compensated for mere quantity. The human fleet responded by doing something no Imperial commander had ever seen. Instead of forming battle lines or defensive positions, the small ships scattered in every direction. They spread across Sol system like seed blown by wind, seeming to flee from the advancing warships. Some Imperial officers laughed at the display. The primitives were already running. Then the attacks began. Human ships emerged from unexpected angles, striking at the edges of the Imperial formation. They did not attempt direct confrontations with capital ships. Instead, they targeted exposed systems, sensor arrays, communication antennas, shield projectors. Dozens of small vessels would swarm at single point, overwhelming defenses with sheer numbers before retreating back into the void. Torvex ordered fighters to pursue, and that was his first major mistake. Imperial fighters were faster than individual human ships, but they were designed for dog fighting, not hunting prey across millions of kilometers. The human vessels led them on twisting chases through asteroid fields where their speed became a liability. Hidden weapons platforms activated as fighters passed, catching them in crossfires they never saw coming. Within the first hour, the Empire lost 300 fighters and damaged nothing significant. The human fleet remained intact, circling the Imperial formation like wolves around a wounded animal. The Admiral adjusted his tactics. He ordered his capital ships to ignore the small attackers and push toward Earth. If they could threaten the planet directly, the humans would be forced to defend it. Standard military logic: protect what matters most or lose it forever. But humanity had anticipated this as well. The path to Earth was littered with obstacles that sensors had somehow missed. Mines drifted in apparently empty space. Automated weapon platforms activated from dormant asteroid supply ships that had seemed Like easy targets exploded when approached, destroying attackers with their cargo of concealed warheads. Imperial fleet was designed to fight other fleets. It was designed for grand battles where formations clashed and the strongest emerged victorious. It was not designed for this slow, grinding warfare, where every advance cost lives and achieved nothing. 6 hours into the battle, Torvix had lost 15 capital ships and accomplished nothing. His fleet was still hours away from Earth, and the human swarm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, they seemed to grow more effective as the battle continued, learning from each engagement and adapting their tactics in real time. The human strategy became clear as the hours passed. They were not trying to destroy the Imperial fleet. They were trying to exhaust it. Every attack targeted logistics. Supply ships were priority targets. Ammunition transports were ambushed before they could reach the front lines. Fuel tankers were disabled and captured rather than destroyed. Torvix realized with growing horror that his fleet was slowly starving. Weapons that should have been fully loaded were running low. Shields that should have been at maximum power were weakening as energy reserves drained. His ships could still destroy any human vessel in seconds, but there were always more humans, and his ammunition was finite. The turning point came 12 hours into the battle. Coordinated attack by 3,000 human ships overwhelmed the escorts protecting the fleet's main supply convoy. The battle lasted only 20 minutes, but when it ended, 2/3 of the fleet's remaining supplies were debris drifting in space. Torv stared at the tactical display, watching icons representing his supplies blink from blue to red. His fleet still outgunned the humans by an enormous margin. His capital ships were barely scratched, but none of that mattered if his weapons fell silent because there was nothing left to fire. He had been hunting the humans for 12 hours, and somehow they had been hunting him the entire time. The decision to retreat was the hardest of his career. Imperial fleets did not retreat. They did not acknowledge that smaller powers could force them back. But Torx was a practical officer, and he understood mathematics. His fleet could continue fighting and eventually run out of ammunition, leaving 300 capital ships helpless in enemy space, or it could withdraw now, resupply, and return with overwhelming force. He chose withdrawal. The human fleet did not pursue as the Imperial ships pulled back. They maintained their swarm formation, watching the retreat with what might have been satisfaction or might have been exhaustion. Both sides had given everything they had. The difference was that humanity had given everything and succeeded, while the Empire had given everything and failed. News of the withdrawal spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Primitive species had fought the Imperial Navy to a standstill. 300 human ships destroyed, but the fleet that came to conquer them had retreated. It was not a victory in any traditional sense. Both sides had suffered losses. Neither had achieved their objectives completely, but perception mattered more than reality, and the perception was devastating for the Empire. On a dozen worlds, citizens who had been obediently silent for generations suddenly found their voices. If humanity could resist, perhaps others could too. If the Empire was not invincible, perhaps the old rules no longer applied. Independence, movements that had been dormant for Centuries stirred back to life. The Imperial Council convened an emergency session as reports poured in from across their territory. High Executive Morvan presented the military analysis with barely contained fury. The fleet had not been defeated, he insisted. It had simply chosen to conserve resources for a more decisive engagement. Victory was still assured, but Emperor Valadros listened to the analysis with ancient eyes that saw past the numbers in statistics. He understood what Morvan did not. The Empire had not lost a battle, it had lost something far more valuable. It had lost the myth of invincibility. For 12,000 years, species had submitted to integration because they believed resistance was impossible. That belief had crumbled in the asteroid fields of solar system. Every world that had ever dreamed of freedom was now calculating whether the dream might become reality. The Emperor called for silence and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. We face a choice. We can send another fleet larger than the first and crush humanity. Through sheer force, we can demonstrate that defiance leads only to destruction. This is the traditional response. It has worked for 12 millennia. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled council. But I wonder if traditions are failing us. We did not build this empire through force alone. We built it by offering something that species wanted. Peace, prosperity, security. We made integration attractive, and so species chose it willingly. Humanity has refused because they want something we do not offer: independence, self-determination, the right to make their own choices. Even if those choices are mistakes, we have always treated these desires as obstacles to be overcome. Perhaps we should instead ask why they matter so much. Morvan interrupted with barely restrained impatience. Your Majesty, with respect, these are philosophical questions that can be debated later. The immediate concern is military. We must respond to this defeat with overwhelming force or face rebellion across the empire. Must we? The Emperor's voice grew cold. I have ruled for 300 years. High Executive, I have seen rebellions crushed and populations subjugated. I have watched species that once had proud cultures become dependent servants. I have maintained order through strength and fear, and now I look at the empire have built, and I wonder what it will become in another 300 years. He stood from his throne, something he rarely did. In formal sessions, I will not send another fleet to Sol System, not yet. I will not condemn humanity to destruction without understanding them first. Perhaps they have something to teach us about what we have forgotten. The council erupted in protest, but the Emperor silenced them with a gesture. His word was law, and his decision was final. There would be no immediate retaliation against Earth. In the aftermath of the battle, both sides tended their wounds and considered the future. Humanity had survived, but at terrible cost. Thousands of pilots had died in the swarm attacks. Countless ships were destroyed. The victory, such as it was, had been purchased with blood. Secretary General Okonkwo addressed the survivors with somber pride. They had proven that humanity would not surrender its freedom. They had shown the galaxy that small powers could stand against empires, but the war was not over. It had barely begun. Question now was what came next. The empire would return eventually with more ships and better strategies. Humanity could not win an extended war against Such overwhelming power, they needed a different solution. They needed to change the terms of the conflict entirely, and somewhere in the imperial capital an ancient emperor was beginning to wonder if the young species called humanity might have answers to questions he had stopped asking long ago. The battle was over. The real struggle was just beginning. 1 year had passed since the Battle of Seoul, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. The Valoran Empire still controlled vast territories, its fleet still patrolled ancient trade routes, and its bureaucracy still administered thousands of worlds. But something fundamental had changed. The certainty was gone. Independence movements had erupted across a dozen sectors, not armed rebellions which the Empire could have crushed easily, but something more dangerous, peaceful demands for autonomy, economic resistance, cultural revival. Species that had been obedient for millennia were suddenly remembering their own histories, their own traditions, their own dreams. The Empire had always maintained control through combination of benefits and fear. Integration offered prosperity and protection. Resistance offered destruction. Most species found the choice obvious, but humanity had demonstrated a third option. Resistance did not have to mean destruction. Empire could be challenged and survived. Emperor Valadro spent long hours studying reports from across his domain, watching the cracks spread through structures that had seemed eternal. His advisors urged military action. Crush the rebellions, they said. Clear his throat, make examples, restore order through fear. But the emperor had lived for centuries, and he understood something his advisors did not. Fear was a resource that could be exhausted. Every rebellion crushed created martyrs. Every population subjugated created resentment that lasted for generations. The Empire could win 100 small wars and still lose the larger struggle. He made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He would travel to Earth personally, not with a fleet, not with threats, just a single diplomatic vessel, carrying the ruler of 3/4 of the known galaxy. His advisors thought he had lost his mind. High Executive Morvan threatened to resign. Imperial Council debated whether the Emperor had become mentally unfit for office, but Valadros had ruled for 300 years through wars, plagues, and crises that would have destroyed lesser leaders. He knew what he was doing, even if no one else understood. The Emperor's ship arrived in Seoul system on a clear morning by Earth's calendar. Human vessels escorted it through the defensive networks that still surrounded the planet. Weapons tracking but not firing. Secretary General Okonkwo met the Emperor at the landing platform in Geneva, standing alone without guards or ceremony. They were a strange pair, an ancient ruler whose species had conquered galaxies, a human leader whose civilization had barely reached the stars. They should have had nothing in common, and yet, when they looked at each other, there was something like recognition in their eyes. Welcome to Earth, Your Majesty, Alcono said. I confess we did not expect this visit. I confess I did not expect to make it, Valados replied. A year ago, I was prepared to destroy your world. Now I am here seeking understanding. The galaxy has changed, Secretary General. I need to understand why. She led him through the city, past buildings that had been damaged in the war and were now being rebuilt, past memorial walls covered with names of those who had died, defending humanity's freedom, past parks, where children played, unaware that the ruler of the largest empire in history was walking among them. Valadros watched everything with the careful attention of someone who had spent centuries analyzing civilizations. He saw the diversity of human cultures, the way different traditions coexisted in the same spaces. He saw the arguments and debates that seemed to erupt constantly over every decision. He saw the chaos that his advisors had always cited as proof of human inferiority, but he also saw something else. He saw adaptation. He saw creativity. He saw a species that had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times and had somehow always found a way to survive and grow. The chaos was not weakness, it was flexibility. It was the ability to change when circumstances demanded change. The emperor spent 3 days on Earth visiting cities and villages, speaking with leaders and ordinary citizens. He asked questions that surprised everyone, not about military capabilities or economic resources, but about history, about philosophy, about what humans believed and why they believed it. On the final day, he met with Secretary General Akinquo in her office for a private conversation that would change the course of galactic history. I have ruled the empire for 300 years, Yinhai said. In that time, I have absorbed hundreds of species into our system. I have brought peace to worlds that had known only war. I have spread prosperity to civilizations that had known only poverty. I believed I was building something great. He paused, looking out the window at a world that had refused everything he offered. But I have also watched cultures disappear. I have watched unique species become copies of each other, all following the same patterns, all thinking the same thoughts. The empire does not conquer through force alone, it conquers through homogeneity. We make everything the same, and in doing so, we destroy what made each species valuable. Okonkwo listened without interrupting. She had learned patience in her years of leadership, the ability to let others reach their own conclusions. Humanity refused integration because you understood something we had forgotten. The emperor continued. Diversity is not chaos. Independence is not disorder. The galaxy does not need a single system that controls everything. It needs many systems that cooperate while remaining distinct. What are you suggesting, Your Majesty? He turned to face her directly. I am suggesting that the empire as it currently exists cannot survive. Cracks are already spreading. In another century, perhaps 2, there will be rebellions we cannot suppress, wars that drain our resources, collapse that destroys everything we have built. Unless we change, unless we become something different, and I believe humanity can show us how. The negotiations that followed lasted for months. They were difficult and contentious, with moments when everything seemed about to collapse. But slowly, painfully, a new framework emerged, not conquest or integration. Partnership. The Treaty of Saul established principles that had never existed in galactic governance. Voluntary cooperation between equal partners, mutual defense without vassalage, trade without exploitation, cultural exchange without erasure. It was idealistic and impractical and probably doomed to fail, but it was also the first time anyone had tried something different. The signing ceremony was held in the same chamber where humanity had rejected every imperial offer, 3 years. Earlier, representatives from a 100 species attended, including the 12 that had secretly supported humanity during the war. They watched as Emperor Valadros and Secretary General Okonkwo signed documents that would reshape civilization. When the Emperor added his seal, he looked at the human leader with an expression that might have been respect or might have been something deeper. 3 years ago, your species said no to everything we offered. Do you know how unprecedented that was? In 12,000 years, no one had ever simply refused. We had no protocols for rejection. We had no strategies for dealing with species that did not want what we provided. We had to say no. Okonkwo replied, we had to prove that it was possible. You proved more than that. You proved that our system was not inevitable. You proved that alternatives existed. You proved that a small species with nothing but determination could challenge an empire that had never been challenged. He paused, something like wonder in his ancient eyes. You terrified us, Secretary General, and perhaps that was exactly what we needed. Outside the chamber, crowds gathered from every corner of the galaxy. Species that had been rivals for millennia stood side by side, watching history unfold. They did not know what the future would bring. They did not know if this fragile new arrangement would survive the challenges ahead, but they knew that something had changed. The old certainties were gone. The old system was crumbling, and in its place, something new was being born. It had started because one young species looked at the greatest power in the galaxy and simply said, no, thank you. It continued because that refusal inspired others to believe that change was possible, and it would endure because the dream of freedom, once awakened, could never truly be extinguished. Secretary General Okonkwo stood at the window of her office after the ceremony, watching the celebration below. Emperor Valadros stood beside her, an unlikely ally in an impossible endeavor. Do you think it will work? She asked. This new system we have created, I do not know, he admitted. Nothing like this has ever been attempted. There will be failures, there will be setbacks, there will be those who prefer the old ways and fight to restore them, but it is worth trying. The ancient emperor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice held something that sounded almost like hope. Humanity taught me something I had forgotten, Secretary General. Sometimes the most important thing is not to succeed. Sometimes the most important thing is simply to try, to believe that something better is possible even when all evidence suggests otherwise, to refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must always be. He turned to face her, and for just a moment, the weight of centuries seemed to lift from his shoulders. Your species calls it hope. I had forgotten what that felt like. Thank you for reminding me. Outside, the celebration continued late into the night. Ships from 100 worlds filled the sky, their lights mixing with the stars. Somewhere in that vast expanse, the future was waiting to be written, and it had all begun because humanity refused to say